In a clumsy way, the Greiner government started freeing up the guidelines for coastal development. They had a bit of wind in their sails on this one. They said there'd been too many restrictions when Carr was Minister for Planning and Environment. We had all these wonderful headland developments ready to move. Well, I let them go a bit on this front, and it got ahead of steam. And we moved in on them. And all of a sudden I had what Tony Abbott is enjoying at the present time, the opportunity of a serious thematic campaign. Because even people who'd voted against us, even people in the Conservative ranks, were not comfortable with National Party ministers in a state government saying we're going to have resorts on every beach on the north coast of New South Wales. And within a year, we'd brought a minister down because he intervened on a development in which he had a hidden pecuniary interest. And we had 2 ministers, including the Deputy Premier, facing corruption investigations by an independent commission against corruption set up by the Greiner government to pursue Labor's record. And I had a keen interest in this subject because of my background as Planning and Environment Minister, but it worked a treat. So an opposition leader in the state arena now has got to be looking for moves by O'Farrell that will open up the opportunity for a thematic campaign, not just one-off criticisms, but for something that rallies support, has people moving back, shifts people back into the Labor column. And it's ideal because you can say, they're doing this, but our alternative policy is to protect coastal wetlands, to ban any more canal estates, and go down the list.
I mean, one of the things I think you really pioneered at that time was something which Abbott does quite well now. It's the real cut-through lines. I remember you describing that process of development as concreting the coast, and the White Shoe Brigade coming down from Queensland to take over. And these are very evocative images, which I think in opposition particularly are incredibly important, because opposition is always you're just striving in opposition always for relevance. It's very hard. You're almost, at its worst, you're living in a netherworld. You're almost like a ghostly, creature that sometimes manages to reach into the real world when something happens. But with those sorts of campaigns, and this is something which I think is critically important for opposition, constant campaigning. With those sorts of campaigns, you become relevant very, very quickly. You set the agenda, you set the tone of the debate, and I think that's one thing that any opposition's got to do from day one. They've got to accept that they're in opposition, but be bold, be determined, and hold the government to account from day one.
I just emphasise the mistake though, because you're only credible if you concede what you got wrong. I was slow to appreciate that Greiner's ramping up of taxes and charges was the thing that concerned the electorate most. From his first months in office, he increased charges for electricity, for water, fares went up markedly, and that was going to hurt him 3 years hence. And because I was on the defensive over his argument that debt had risen too high, Labor were incompetent economic managers, I was slow to get stuck into that. But looking back, maybe that gave him a false sense of security, and when we closed in on him in the 1991 election, campaigning solely on taxes and charges, it was all made for us. It was all set up for us.
Claire, do you want to comment on that?
I think one of the things we faced in opposition was the fact that we, as Bruce said, weren't the natural party of government in the Territory, and in numbers it's a very small place. So what we had to do, rather than be an opposition who was an angry, negative opposition, what we did was to be as constructive as possible. So when government had a good idea, as Bob said before, we praised it, we tried to value add to it, and there was no time that we didn't, there were things inevitably we had to criticise about government, but it was always so that you couldn't have a television grab that just took the negative. It was not on that one, what we would do. And so it was always trying to balance a negative with a positive so that we wouldn't look like a bunch of ratbags that you'd never put in government, that you actually, every time you saw us, we were, and you struggled to get, onto the media. But every time you saw us, there was something positive coming from one of the small band of Labor's mouths.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important. You've got to avoid being the angry final paragraph in the story. You actually, as Bob taught us from day one, you've got to have your three positive alternatives in the press release or in the statement, which tell the electorate, what it is that you would do that's different. James, could I just ask you a question now? When Blair was opposition leader, he actually went about the business of reforming, and serious structural reform took place inside the Labor Party at that time. Do you think, opposition is the natural time to do the serious business of reform?
I do, yes. And I guess, is the story of Clause 4, the reform of Clause 4, well known here? I'm guessing it is, yeah. And I guess the way in which we went to a one-member, one-vote system with, as was discussed earlier, votes for trade unionists and for parliamentarians as well, was important not just because it addressed a negative about us, which was people thought we were controlled by the unions, but it was also a demonstration that he was prepared to stick his neck on the line for things that he believed in. And the great danger, I think even more now certainly than in 1994, is that people think we only say what we're saying because we focus grouped it, and that they've become incredibly savvy about politicians saying what people want to hear. And if you can do something where you are really in opposition, putting your neck on the line, that can demonstrate a whole bunch of things which they will take into the kind of leader that you will be in government. And I think that's particularly one of the things that people look at when they're looking at an opposition is, are you captured by your own vested interests? So with the right, they look at, are you captured by business? With us, they look at, are you captured by unions, public sector workers? Are you, in the end, well-intentioned, but it's not going to work because you're not prepared to do the tough things that are necessary? And it's very hard to demonstrate that in opposition because, of course, you would say whatever you would say, whereas doing something with which you do have genuine power in opposition, i.e. your party structures, can be a real sort of symbol of what prediction of what you will be like in government. So another interesting example of that is at the moment, Helle Thorning-Schmidt, who's the Danish social democratic leader, is doing a similar version of slightly different, but she says that her response whenever there's a policy issue that comes to her as the opposition leader, her first reaction is to say, well, what should Labour's interests be doing more to help with this issue? So there was a big debate about productivity in Denmark after the financial crisis, and her thing was to say, okay, well, I'm going to sit down with the unions and say, can we negotiate, I think they've got a sort of 34, 35-hour week, can we negotiate 1 or 2 more hours from everybody? And that is her saying, okay, I understand that there's a big issue about Denmark's productivity, but I'm going to address it by showing that I'm going to get my people to play their part in that. And that's a sort of a way of counterintuitively showing, yes, you're on people's side, but you're prepared to do the tough things that will be necessary in government.
I thought we might open it up now for questions. I'm sure there's more than yeah, Mikkel, you're saying? The question was, what can we draw from the return of Mikkel, which could be a thesis topic for Bob Carr. Bob?
To be a bit heretical, probably not a great deal. For the benefit of our visitors, Labor had governed in New South Wales in the Depression, and the government had failed, broken by the forces of the Depression, and under an authoritarian and very bossy leader, really sunk. The party really sunk for the rest of the 30s. And federal intervention set up a new party structure, and a moderate leader, William Mikkel, took the party back to government in 1941. Probably the only standout feature for us from his victory is the selection of candidates in rural seats who were part of their community and not necessarily members of the ALP. Popular local identities, mayors and judges of cattle and pigs in local agricultural shows. He stuck a Labor badge on their lapel, and they were more country party than the country party. And that raft of country seats is the standout thing. It turned out to set the style for other Labor governments in New South Wales. We didn't have public housing until the Mikkel government in 1941. We didn't really have a modern public service until he came in. And it was very important, but I think that's the standout horses for courses, as they referred to them. The broadening of Labor's base, Labor becoming what Americans would see as a worker farmer party, was McKell's contribution that has enduring value to us.
What kind of things should or could a Labor government do to make sure that they're in a strong position to fight from opposition when that time comes? Or is that...
That's a good question. James?
I think they should, yes. And I think there's two things which we can really learn from mistakes that we made in the UK. The first was that once we got into power, we really neglected party reform and, to a certain extent, the party machine. But I think there's certainly some things that we could have done in government in terms of reforming the party, which we're now slightly regretting not having done. So, for example, in government, obviously the Prime Minister chooses who is in the cabinet. There was always a rule in the Labour Party parliamentary rule book that the parliamentarians elected the shadow cabinet. And in a modern system, I don't know how it's done here, but in a modern system, that feels a bit anachronistic. I think the leader should be, and most people probably think the leader should be choosing who's in his shadow cabinet. We should probably have changed that in government. So there are some things that you can sort of, without becoming self-defeating, you can do in government in case opposition does come along. I think the other thing that we didn't do was what I was trying to say yesterday, is make a long-term Labour case. I think by, to a certain extent, conceding on the ideology to Thatcherism, but then trying to win on the policy and do as much as we could within a framework of saying actually markets broadly work, what we did was we had a short-term gain, but a long-term loss, which is we weren't building a Labour case, a sort of ideologically Labour case for what we were doing. But I just want to emphasise what I was trying to say yesterday, which is I'm not saying go back to only a Labour base and go back to the old policies that we had. I'm trying to say the opposite. I'm saying you need to be as brave about making your argument as a Labour argument as you are brave about reforming your policies when they're no longer right. So actually I'm saying, so on schools, I would say that would mean being very pro-reform in schools, being pro-league tables, being pro-using different providers, because it is the people who are the poorest in society who suffer most when our schools fail them. So, we had a place called Hackney in London, which people might know, which had for decades terrible failing schools, has now got average results as good as those in the country, despite being one of the poorest places in the country. And it's happened because of some things which are pretty controversial, bringing in academies who are different providers, having some quite tough stuff on getting rid of bad teachers. The local educational authority was privatized for a while. And actually, I think that the challenge is to be brave on those policies as a way of making a Labour argument, rather than being brave on those policies, but ceding the ideological argument to the right. So I'm trying to say, actually, so on markets, for example, we should be clear that markets do fail and that we want to protect people from them, but we should also say that sometimes they work incredibly well. So actually, the argument on whether you should protect people in the mining sector, which came up yesterday, should not be, well, I'm not going to do that because I don't believe in interfering in markets. The argument should be, what is going to protect the jobs? And actually, it might be sometimes a free trade policy. It might be saying, okay, it's going to be tough for the people in these particular industries, but we can save most jobs by being pro-free trade. So I'm saying make the argument Labour, but be just as reforming about the policy as I would say the Progressives had been very successfully over the last 20 years.
I want to add just one quick point. The one thing I think, and I think you're touching upon it, that always happens with governing parties is you become complacent. And you always do how you achieve success in the previous election. And if you don't constantly reevaluate, you don't appreciate things that are happening around you. And what I mean by that is the Democratic Party and where it was at in 2002 and where it's at today needs to constantly do a critical analysis as to what are the new techniques that are working, what are the demographics amongst particular constituencies, and how do they want to be talked to? Because the reality is people under the age of 35 amongst a particular demographic don't want to be talked to the same way people that are 45 in that demographic. And if you don't appreciate those nuances, that's when you quickly become irrelevant. And that's the one thing I think that governing parties don't do enough is they kind of get used to that complacency of, well, it worked last time, I'll work next time. And I think there's always got to be a reevaluation process throughout this, throughout the whole process.